How does it feel to rob a bank? What's the feeling when you're done with it and when you're just walking out?
There's a line in the sidewalk that when you walk over it, it's like it's already done. Whatever happens, c'est la vie. And now you're in a pretty serious circumstance, so you have to have your head about you. And then when you come out of the place, that's the other place that, if you were doing risk assessments on a bank robbery, the other place is when you come out, there's a really high propensity to lose your life at that moment. There's a lot of things that you learn about yourself when you have a big stack of money in front of you and it's all yours. Um, yeah, you learn that you're actually not a very nice person. You know, there's the fantasy. There's the fantasy of robbing a bank. There's the fantasy of stealing money and getting away with it. I robbed a bank in Montreal, and it was in a neighborhood. I had done a risk assessment on it, and one of the things that convinced me that it was a very good bank and that it was a low chance of getting caught was that the majority of people that used the bank were elderly. And one of the women who worked in the bank said to me, "This woman here is 80 something years old. She can't get on the floor. Is it okay if she sits in the chair?" I just thought, I said, yes, of course she can sit in the chair. But I felt like such a piece of shit. And nobody wants to be that guy. Nobody thinks about that. They think about getting away with the money. And I did get away with the money. But I'm not that guy. I'm not some freak that's humiliating an 80-year-old woman. And yet that's exactly what I did. And you don't see that stuff until you sit back and reflect on how much harm you cause people. Prison is only about two things: power and control. That's the end all and be all of incarceration. You have to learn how to shut your brain off. Nothing was happening. There was no external input. The guard would come by and throw a sandwich on his floor 3 times a day, and sometimes it was urinated on because they thought he had killed another correctional officer. But other than that, there was nothing happening in that room. It all happened in his head. All the fights, all the arguments, all the anger, all the depression was all, that's prison. Prison is nothing. It's just a room. It's just a place that's segregated from society. It's what happens in people's heads inside that room that determines the entire outcome of the experience.
It's the mindset. You cannot tell me a prison system is not a representation of the country's mindset. I mean, you can tell a lot about a nation by how they treat their elderly and their prisoners.
So what I want to say is,
I don't know if you're ashamed of your past or whatever, but I find it fascinating, honestly. So, as Gregory Lloyd Hansen, which was your name before you changed it, you had a criminal record dating back to 1984. You were serving an 8-year sentence for robbery when you escaped minimum security institution in a dumpster while working in a prison kitchen. This made national headlines because it happened while the security critic for the National Reform Party happened to be visiting the prison. Fucking hilarious. It was during that time that you also committed a second-degree murder of the guy who helped you carry out a number of robberies in Montreal. In 1995, you received a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 13 years. When you were eligible for parole, you decided not to seek it. You applied for parole 15 years after you first could, and we're going to go through the reason why later on. Somewhere in here, you also committed a bank robbery in the United States. Okay.
Is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? Starting therapy can be hard. The right therapist for you may not be in your area. BetterHelp is now sponsoring this podcast. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. With BetterHelp, you can have your therapy session as a phone call, as a video chat, or even via messaging if you prefer that. If you think you might benefit from therapy, consider BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/captainese. Clicking that link helps you support this channel, and it also gives you a 10% off your first month of BetterHelp so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. Again, go to betterhelp.com/captainese. Clicking that link gives you 10% off your first month of therapy.
Even if you hate the guts of your name, you have to carry it somehow. You feel obligated because what are you going to do? Become another person? You know? But you did that. You changed your name from Gregory Lloyd Hansen to Iridian Granada. Was it easier to become another, to adopt another identity if you changed the whole thing and kind of try to forget about your past?
No, what happened was that, you know what, when you end up in a circumstance that I was in, and I came to a blunt reality that I had gone exactly in the wrong direction and that I had caused tremendous harm to innocent people, to people that I care about, and to myself. Um, yeah, that was a tough day. And so I knew that there was going to be, you know, if not rebranding in terms of words, I was going to need to reimagine who Greg Hansen was. And so I spent a lot of time doing that inside and really trying my best, you know what, to change, to genuinely change, not just in front of the mirror, not in front of the parole board or your parents or anybody else, to genuinely change is one of the hardest things you will ever do. Because no matter where you go, there you are. And, you know, if you like this, your brain just does what it does. It wants to be what it wants to be, right? So I put full effort, full effort into trying to reinvent myself to get rid of the old person. And funny thing happens, I went out to Quebec, which is about 2,600 miles across the nation from here. And I did that to participate in a process called Restorative Justice, which was I wanted to offer myself to the family of the man who I murdered, to answer any questions, to demonstrate to them my contrition, all that kind of stuff. And so restorative justice is kind of a thing here in Canada. It's been practiced for a while. There's a big community. My wife and I went out there to continue my journey and to provide whatever it was that the family needed from me. You know, I didn't want to be presumptuous. I just wanted to be there to present myself if they had questions. Maybe they didn't want to talk to me. Maybe they wanted to hit me in the head with a shovel. I think the latter one, I don't think they were actually allowed to do that, some kind of a law. But the part about them wanting to ask questions and so forth, I presented myself for that. So we get out to Quebec, and this is great fun. A little bit of a side story. Inside of Canadian prison, there is a hierarchy of responsibilities, and one of those hierarchies is a preventive security officer. So they're kind of like the KGB. They're like the internal CIA type people. They listen to your phone. They're always trying to prevent things from happening bad. They're the intelligence organ inside of prison. And they have a file on you, which is very KGB-ish, right? And that file is physically locked in a safe that only 4 people have a combination to: the warden, the deputy warden, and 2 preventive security officers. And all of a sudden in 2011, I was contacted and said, you're under investigation because a portion of your preventive security file is missing and we can't find it and we don't know where it is. So there's a big investigation going on. I said, well, it's not under my bed. So, you know, bon chance, we wish you luck on your investigation. Of course, seeing as there's only 4 people who have the combination of that safe and there were 18 pieces of paper missing from the file, and I'm not one of the people with the combination of that safe, it was the end of the investigation was inconclusive. And read into that what you will. The fun part of it was, here's where it gets interesting, is that a guy calls out to me one night, hey, you're on TV. This is about 2011, 2012. You're on TV. They had a French documentary show that was about, their whole shtick was escapes from prison. And because I had escaped from prison in 1994, there I was in all my glory. And so I was just learning French, but I watched the program. And for me, it was more accurate than anything I had ever seen. And I thought, where did they get that level of accuracy? And then I went, whoa, I think it's a documentary based on the 18 missing pages of my file. Yeah. Somebody from inside the prison stole it and sold it to a documentary company. So how that leads into the name change is that I'm a barber in the barber shop. I'm cutting some kid's hair. And I said to him, I said, what's your name? He tells me. I asked him, he says, what's your name? I say, Greg Hansen. The kid's eyes light up like this. He goes, you're Greg Hansen. You're Greg Hansen. And he proceeds to regale to me how in love he is with me and my story and what a solid convict and an incredible criminal I was. And I went home and I phoned my mate and I said, you know what? I was heartbroken. It was like a punch in the guts. It felt like it took away everything that I had worked toward for probably 15 years at that time. And I was discouraged. And she said, she's the one who came up with it. She said, we're going to change our name sometime. Why don't we do it now? Just do it now. Just distance yourself from that persona. And so I talked to everybody about it because I didn't want anybody to misinterpret what I was doing as me trying to attempt to hide or whatever, right? So I worked with the legal authorities, I worked with prison authorities, worked with my family foremost, because they're the ones who gave me my original name, worked with my faith community, worked with a native elder, because that's part of my cultural history. And at the end, it just felt completely right. Everything fit into a glove. And it was very natural. When your mother starts calling you by your new name and then referring to you in her memories and saying, do you remember when I said to you when you were 5, Iridian? And I thought, wow, she's really rewired, right? So if mom can do it, the whole world can do it.
Yeah, well, I really find it fascinating that when the crime happens, the family is usually they just feel hatred towards that person and they don't want to see them ever and they want them to burn in hell, right? Just be in prison and don't bother us at all. We hate you. But then after a while, when the dust settles, a lot of time family is just curious. So when you hear about, when you listen to these interviews, they say sometimes, I just want to talk to him. I just want to talk and see what's up, why they did it. That's what's eating these people inside more than hatred. So it's really interesting. So did the family actually show up?
Nobody showed up. So, and that's kind of the process of restorative justice. Like, restorative justice is kind of an umbrella phrase. One of the features of it is mediation, or conciliation between the victim or the victim's family and the person who caused harm, right? So there are professionals that work in that field here in Canada. And so I get to Quebec, and one of the guys, he says to me, he says, listen, here's how it works with me. He says, legally, I can't even go approach the family. I have to approach through a police officer. So he approached through, and he says, if you don't hear back from me, it's because you're not going to hear back from me, because they don't want to hear from you. They've moved on, they've passed away, whatever the case might be. So he said, I'm only one guy working in a province of 10 million people. And he says, I'm super busy. I'm very interested in your case. But if you don't hear back from me, it's because there's no smoke, there's no fire, there's nothing happening here. And yeah, never heard back from them. So I just continued to live my life in that process of trying to heal, because when you create, you talked about Maribor being a very safe place. You're a citizen of Maribor. When something happens in Maribor, it happens directly to the victim, but it impacts everybody that's there. It makes you feel more nervous at night going to your car or whatever, right? So I just continued to live my life as an apology to the larger community that I knew I had impacted, right?
How do you go about forgiving yourself permanently? Because, I mean, a lot of us have done stuff that we're not really proud of, but some of us took it to another level, which I've done some shit, man. And hey, a statute of limitations. But for a while, I found it really hard to forgive myself. And it doesn't matter what other people say, it doesn't really quite matter until you forgive yourself. So to me, what I did was I meditate. And when I meditate, I speak to God, for lack of a better word. And I said, look, this is between you and me. You're the one from who I'm seeking forgiveness because you are me, right? We're all God, we're all one consciousness. And I just really found it hard to forgive myself for quite a while. I didn't really know how to go about it. And it's just something that's eating you from the inside. It's a lot more difficult than having other people be mad at you and not forgive you and you forgiving yourself. That's like way easier than the other way around. So how do you go about it?
you have to make peace with it. I'm just going to speak in my language. You got to get over it. There's just hanging on to that guilt, that sort of self-flagellation, is a little bit of exercise in selfishness. And selfishness is exactly what causes a person to do the things that they do that cause others harm, right? So you have to, I had to recognize, let's be clear about that. I had to get to this place, and it took a couple of years, because for the first couple of years, I was awash in grief, because I knew I had completely screwed myself and my family and all these. I did it. The whole shit show happened in my head, right? And so I thought, I was weeping and grieving for my, pain and suffering and all the grief I'd caused my family. And then I just had this day where I said, what is this doing? Like, this is just a bunch of me throwing dust in the air. And it's all about me. And I knew that if I was going to make any progress in my life, I had to stop living a life where everything was about me. So I had to let go of it. And now when you let go of it, you've got all this energy that you were turning inwards, and you were just like, I'm so guilty. I'm so guilty. You let go of that. And now you can turn that energy outwards, and you can start to do some positive things to help other people. And that's the thing for me that helped me to get over it. It might be kind of cavalier to say get over it, but you got to get over it.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so you not forgiving yourself is a very selfish act. You're being very self-absorbed and, in a way, egotistical when you make it all about you. And your egotism is what caused you to do the thing which you're trying to forgive yourself for in the first place. So it's a circle. Okay, that's interesting. So how did you get caught?
There's a book in that question. So here's what happens to me. I'll walk you back. How I end up in cell doing 13 years is that I came to a realization that if I was going to change, I had to look fearlessly at where I was and attack it, right? So I made the decision to plead guilty to every outstanding charge that I had and the couple that I didn't have. And so I called in the police services and I said, listen, this is me. This is what I did. This is when I did it. This is why I did it, to my understanding at the time. And I'm sorry. And what's the bill? And so, I advise this all the time. And the phrase that I use with guys that I talk to about taking accountability is I tell them, you got to man up. You did this. You got to own your shit. And that is, I think it's a responsibility of every human being to do that at every level. But I also believe that it's the privilege to do that.
But you see, that's what scares me. You never get away with anything ever whatsoever. It's when you do something bad, it's almost as if it's written in a note somewhere, like a notepad, where when you've done something bad, it's already written down. So now when I realized that, like, I started getting creative. I want to participate in my own karma in a way. So when I do something bad, like, automatically I do something good afterwards. I kind of try to, I wouldn't say I try to neutralize it, but I try to kind of make like an even playing field where the bad is covered with good. So then when the boomerang comes around, because it's going to, it's a little bit less pain because I already started doing positive things to ameliorate it. So that's really interesting. How many years did you spend in prison altogether?
So I had done an accountability thing in 1994. I pled guilty to all of my outstanding charges, and I received that sentence of life 13. In Canada, you've read my report. In Canada, everyone gets out eventually. And so a sentence of life 13 does not focus so much on the life. It focuses more on the 13. 2001, I'm sitting there, and a cute little black RCMP officer comes up to the Canadian prison and he says to me, hey, what do you know about a bank robbery in El Cajon, California in 1992? And I smiled at him and I said, well, I know I did it. And he said, are you ready to sign a confession? I said, hey, relax, Max. Did you see the fence? Like, there's razor wire, and I'm pretty sure the guy in the blue truck has a gun. We're not going anywhere. I'm in Canada. He says, oh, no, we have a new program for you. So by 2003, some too smart by half lawyers in the Canadian Department of Justice had cooked up a strategy where they could extradite a serving life sentenced Canadian prisoner to another country. They thought that they could do it legally. Turns out that they actually couldn't. But the decision that they came up with and their boss, the Minister of Justice in Canada, signed off on was that if and when I received parole on my life sentence in Canada, that they would ship me to the States where I would probably get as much as 30 years. And then if I survived that process, I could come back to Canada. Not a great incentive for signing up for parole. More importantly, I had come to a place in my life where I tried to make decisions based on principle rather than just strictly emotion. And the principle was that I had given my commitment to my wife that I would be here in Canada, that I would provide emotionally and financially and spiritually for her. And so I found myself stuck between two places. This pattern of accountability that I had already set in 1994 of taking ownership of my shit, which was very precious to me, but also living up to my word to my wife. So when you don't know what to do, you sometimes just have to stand still and see how things unfold and for a clearer vision. That didn't happen for 2001, 2020, 19 years.
Okay, hold on. Back up a little bit. How is that possible? Because it seems to me like a catch-22. So you're in prison in Canada. You have an outstanding charge in the United States. You want to apply for parole in Canada, but you cannot do it before you deal with the charge. But you cannot deal with that charge unless you apply for parole because you have to be in the United States to deal with a charge.
Except for a little thing that came out of China in the form of a virus called COVID. The US Congress passed a law during COVID that people could plead guilty in US federal court to their outstanding charge by video. And we were able to find a US judge in Southern District of California who interpreted that as not prohibiting video from another nation. But she's got no precedent to work with until a woman who was in Vancouver, whose father is a major ranking general in the Chinese army and who was the CFO for Huawei Corporation, the Chinese telecommunications giant. She was stuck here in Vancouver on outstanding US charges having to do with money. And she had $10 million worth of lawyers because that's what telecommunications giants whose dads are generals in the US or the Chinese army have. Her lawyers secured her an arrangement where she could plead guilty in New York Southern District from a video conference in Vancouver. She was the precedent. So that happens. And the next thing you know, little old guy who makes $5 a day cleaning toilets in the federal penitentiary is pleading guilty for the first time ever in Canadian history over video conference from a Canadian prison in a California courtroom. And I think they were patting themselves on the back on how novel it was that they had done this. But I was sitting back thinking about all the things that had to line up in the universe in order for that to be accomplished. And so then I was sitting there thinking, did this really happen to me? Did this actually, like it seems impossible. It's like a fairy tale. And then I start thinking about, no, you do good work, you put in your efforts and so forth, and everything, the universe is just built this way. Positive finds positive, and eventually, if you're patient, things work themselves out.
Okay, so altogether you were in prison for how long? Like in and out?
Oh my God. I spent all of my formative years as an adult in prison. I came in at 17 years of age, just turning 17, and never got out until I was 57. And in that period of time, I probably spent 3 years total out in the community, and all of it was spent running from the police or wreaking havoc. So I wasn't truly free. Yeah, I was mostly incarcerated.
Can I ask you something honestly? How does it feel to rob a bank? What's the feeling when you're done with it and when you're just walking out and you see that nobody stopped you? Is it a thrill? Do you feel the best you've ever felt in your life, or do you get super paranoid?
Yeah. Um, wow, that's a long time. That's what year is this? It's 23, 24, something like that. I think the last bank robbery was 95, 94. So that's a wow, that's 30 years. Um, there's a place in the sidewalk. You're scared. I was scared. I'm a kid who paid the bed till I was 5 years old, so I'm just perpetually scared anyway, all the time. But there's a line in the sidewalk that when you walk over it, it's like it's already done. Whatever happens, c'est la vie. You've made your decision, right? It's like jumping off a cliff. Once you're off the cliff, well, you enjoy the ride, right? So there's that line in the sidewalk. Once you've gone over that line in the sidewalk, you're committed. And now you're in a pretty serious circumstance. So you have to have your head about you. And then when you come out of the place, that's the other place that, if you were doing risk assessments on a bank robbery, the other place is when you come out, there's a really high propensity to lose your life at that moment. Because police take bank robbery pretty seriously, especially since that stuff in LA in the 90s where the guys came out shooting with machine guns. Everybody thinks that's going to happen. Mostly the bank robbers in Canada come out the door and shoot with a needle. They shoot some heroin into their arm afterwards. That's mostly what they're shooting. But so you're nervous, you're scared. And then the worst thing that can ever happen, the worst, you probably know this from your personal life, is when you do something like that and you get away with it. Because now you think, no, now you think, I'm friggin' God, man.
But do you have a sense of paranoia in your life after that? Like when you look around and somebody looks at you for 3 seconds too long and you already think, oh, fuck, they know something.
Nope. I just thought I thought I was bulletproof after that. I thought I had just invented the brand new industry that I could just rob banks in perpetuity and that I would never, there's no consequence to it, right? I came out and I had, taken a very, very large amount of money in my very first bank robbery back in 1992, 1993, somewhere in there. And I came out and, there's a lot of things that you learn about yourself when you have a big stack of money in front of you and it's all yours. Um, yeah, you learn that you're actually not a very nice person, and that you are the person that you never thought you'd become. But what are you going to do? Say no? One for me, right? It's a nice split.
Yeah, but after a while, it does pay off with these small um immoral acts, like I park at a certain parking spot for about 5 months now. You're not supposed to park here, but I haven't got a ticket so far. So now I'm gonna keep on doing it because now it's rational. I mean, it was worth it, even if I got the parking ticket, because I've been doing it for so long. It's like, okay, I parked there 60 times. Now I got a ticket that, like, this is $20 for parking there 60 times for like half a day. It's worth it, right? So
Here's something I have to tell you, though. I have to put it in context, okay? And so whether you use this or not, it's me and you stuff here, okay? So I, there's the fantasy. There's the fantasy of robbing a bank. There's the fantasy of stealing money and getting away with it. I robbed a bank in Montreal that I pled guilty to, so I have no problem telling you or your audience about it. And I went in, and it was in a neighborhood. I had done a risk assessment on it, and one of the things that convinced me that it was a very good bank and that it was a low chance of getting caught was that the majority of people that used the bank were elderly, and they lived in kind of a gentrified sort of a neighborhood in Montreal. So I went in and I did what I did, and I laid the thing down and told everybody on the floor. And one of the women who worked in the bank said to me, "This woman here is 80 something years old. She can't get on the floor. Is it okay if she sits in the chair?" And my dick felt about that big at that moment. Okay. I just thought, I said, yes, of course she can sit in the chair. But I felt like such a piece of shit at that moment. And later on, when I reflected on that moment, I grew up kind of thinking, wow, I want to be John Dillinger, and I want to be this bank robber, and I want to be Bonnie and Clyde. And I just realized John Dillinger was a complete asshole. And nobody wants to be that guy. Nobody thinks about that. They think about getting away with the money, and I did get away with the money. But I'm not that guy. I'm not some freak that's humiliating an 80-year-old woman, and yet that's exactly what I did. And you don't see that stuff until you sit back and reflect on how much harm you cause people. It's crime is not cool. I don't watch television shows on it. I'm not turned on by it. It doesn't do anything for me. I just think it's small dick stuff.
What made you use a dumpster to escape prison?
Because it was there. I mean, I'm a guy who super overcomplicates things by nature. And so I had envisioned a high tension wire from the back of the baseball diamond over the fence. I had envisioned guys coming with an acid and pouring it on the fence and cutting me out while holding the guards at gunpoint. I dreamed up all this stuff. And then my friend said to me, "Hey, you know that the garbage can leaves every Wednesday morning at 9:00?" Really? Yeah. It was that. And you know what somebody said to me? They said, "You got in a dumpster that compressed like you could have been killed. Like what did you do to?" Yeah, I unplugged it. What do you mean I unplugged it? Well, it was plugged into the wall and I just pulled the plug.
But you do learn a lot of crime in prison, right? You learn how to, it's almost an institution where you can get a free mentor.
Prison is bank robbery school, actually. So, which is why I highly advocate that we keep the folks who are kind of bent and broken in that direction, we keep them out of there as long as we possibly can, because it's really not to our advantage to have them sitting in there learning how to be more dangerous and have less empathy for their fellow human beings.
Okay, and when you get to prison, what are some survival tips? What's the best way of being in prison as someone just entering for the first time?
There's a real easy way to do time. It's the old monkey thing, right? So speak less, hear more, and don't pretend. Like these kids, these poor young people would come into maximum security and they were so afraid. I used to say they smelled like pee, right? So they were so afraid that they would put on this persona to, which is what we do as human beings. When we're scared, we puff ourselves up. Animals puff themselves up to try and make themselves look bigger. And I said, the very first thing you're doing is you're attracting attention to yourself from some very, very dangerous, predatory human beings. So don't do that. Just be you. And if you don't know who you are, which is very possible, you're here, just let it unfold organically. Just relax. Don't try and be something that you aren't, because you will get yourself in a lot of problems doing that. And speak less, listen more, you'll be okay.
Yeah, but you're still going to be tested though. Like people are going to come to you. I feel like when you first enter prison as a first timer, you kind of had this aura around you that's just attracting predators. And like if you know anything about predators, it's almost as if they can smell someone who is a potential victim. Maybe you're doing something or not doing something that you should do, and these people can tell that you're not a veteran. So you're going to be tested, and you're going to be, well, you're definitely going to be bullied. I mean, bullies are going to at least try to do it. So what's the strategy? Do you do the same thing you would do with bullies in high school?
The identical strategy that we give to young people: avoid them. Just and don't, what are bullies looking for? They're looking for power and control over you. So they're looking for you to show fear. They're looking for you to argue with them and fight with them so that they can show their dominance physically. Just don't engage. Just smile, keep walking, right? I mean, and we teach our children that. And believe me, elementary school, I don't know about Slovenia, but in Canada, elementary school is probably tougher than prison.
Yeah, kids are vicious. The worst insults I've heard were from elementary school kids. They're oof.
In prison, it's funny because bullies aren't actually countenanced, not in Canadian prison very often. And so, if you see a guy picking on another guy, there are some very capable and dangerous prison people in prison. And we don't like that. Like in Canada versus the United States, sexual things are, they don't fly. So if we heard that a man had raped another man in the prison shower or something like this, that man would be possibly killed, surely absolutely removed from that community, because we really hate that in Canada. We hate sexual stuff, whereas in the States it seems to be more de rigueur. It's the common thing, right? It's how they weird trip down there, right? Very violent community.
Yeah, well, I mean, it also depends on the country here, because in United States, a lot of males that enter prison, they actually become, and they weren't really gay in the first place, because being a trans woman, it can be a good business. Some of these men are making good money in there, man, being trans women. But okay, but I'm gonna play the devil's advocate here a little bit. If someone enters prison and they enter because they've done something um, cruel, unusual, and cruel and vicious, why shouldn't the punishment be cruel and unusual? If someone killed in a very cruel way, why shouldn't they be treated bad?
They are. I don't know that. I'm not even sure that the United States puts up with this. In Canada, they receive harsh treatment. They are socially vilified. They're often put in a section of the prison where there's a lot more restrictions. They call that protective custody. Um, they're looked down on by the guards, so forth, right? So that happens. I think that's part of nature. Let's take someone like me. Let's not categorize stuff as, he killed children. I killed a child. I killed someone's child. But the fact that the guy was 30 years old doesn't negate the fact that he was somebody's child, right? So why shouldn't someone like me be treated badly, be vilified, be, just treated horribly in prison? And who's giving the treatment? There's the other side of the question. Should guards treat me horribly? Should inmates treat me horribly? Should society treat me horribly? This denunciation that they're giving me. And it goes back to the whole thing about corrections. For a long, long time, I don't know about Slovenia, but in Canada, we have a system called the Canadian correctional system, right? It's not called the Canadian Penitentiary Service or the Canadian punishment system. It's called the correctional system. So if you want to correct anybody, I got a 3-year-old grandson. So if you want to correct them, what do you have to do? You have to model behavior that you want them to imitate and then reinforce it with positive reinforcement. I mean, that just makes sense, doesn't it? If I want to teach somebody not to be violent and to show him how to do that, I'm going to be violent to him and then say, there, how do you like that? It doesn't work, because what we actually taught the guy is how to get that sense of dominance that he was looking for in his life anyways. We have to use our head, not just our dick, right?
There's also, I don't know what's in us, but it's sort of, I mean, we don't really think rationally when we're sending people to prison, because rationally we would want them to become better, face your demons and become a better person. We want to see something that I think we call justice, but we want to see them suffer as much as the victim suffered, because that would satisfy our feeling of
Re-leveling the playing field. You talked about the fact that people don't even think about people getting out of prison. We live in a very fantasy driven society that takes absolutely almost zero accountability for its decisions. I'll give you an example. I'll take you out of criminal justice and put you into finance. I just went down to the bank down here and met a really nice young man, laid my whole story out to him, I figure, you know what? I'm untrollable if I Google myself in front of the guy. So I just give the guy everything. So this is me. You know what? I'm a former bank robber and I'd like to open a bank account and I'd like you guys to give me a line of credit. He's like, well, that's ballsy. Yeah. But you know what? I'm just telling you the truth. You want me to come and play out here with everybody else? I did my time. Let's go, right?
I mean, that's a good point, being untrollable. I think that's a very good strategy because if I lay it out there, if I say it before you say it, then I'm one step ahead. You have nowhere to go. I already said it. It's already out there. So what are you going to do? I think Trump does that really well, by the way. So what he does is he says whatever happened in his life, he puts it out there first. and he does it in a hilarious way. So yeah, I did this to this woman, and we talked about, and then she said, blah, blah, and everyone's like, yeah, okay, he did it. So what? So what? Right now, if it came out in the news media and if he hadn't put it out there, it would be a different story. So yeah, so that is a good strategy, though.
But I'm sitting talking with the young man, and now he's having a conversation with me, not in a condescending fashion or as a former prisoner or as a former legal wrongdoer. He's just talking to me. And he said, here in Canada, he said, I can't believe the amount of debt that people are living with. They live like they are kings and queens on Visa's dime and on MasterCard's dime, on the credit card's dime. And then they are carrying massive, massive amounts of debt that they don't know how to pay back. And I said, well, why wouldn't they? Their governments are doing the exact same thing, right? So Canadians already have it in their brain that there's no consequences to what they do. They just think that they can live however. So now take it back to criminal justice. They think, okay, we can put a person in prison because that's our criminal justice system. We catch the guy, we take him to court, we find him guilty. Everybody knows what these American crime shows are like. There's a finish to the show. The guy goes to prison. Then what? Well, eventually the guy gets out of prison. And what was he doing while he was in there? And that you were paying for? And what do you want him to do when he comes out, by the way? Do you want him released to your neighborhood because he's coming to your neighborhood and he's coming broke, hungry, and horny? Like, hello, what do you want? What do you want from the prison system? And so that was what my report was about. I used my own experience when I had first come from a maximum to a medium security prison in Canada. They were starting to do something called correctional programs, which was like cognitive behavioral therapy, group sessions, 10, 12 guys. And they really just sat down and asked us realistic questions. What do you want? Okay, so you're out there robbing banks, you're out there doing dope, whatever it is that you're doing, what do you want? And they really stuck us like a bug to a board with a pin. They wouldn't let us off that question until we came up with an answer that we could live with. So I took the challenge and I went back and I said, yeah, what do I want? Why am I doing this shit? Like, I know it's not good, but why am I not? I don't know. It could be anything. Why am I doing this? And I think that has to be the purpose of prison. That is the future of incarceration in the 21st century. Incarceration has to be about sending people to, for a lack of a better term, cognitive university. CogU.
I want to touch on solitary confinement a little bit, though. That's physical isolation of individuals, right? So they're being confined to like a single cell for 22 and a half hours or more per day. So that means they use the toilet, eat, and sleep in the same cell. Oftentimes, the cell doesn't have windows. Actually, I watched an interview with an inmate who spent 40 years in solitary confinement. 40 years. So, and Mandela rules, I think they only permit solitary confinement for 15 days. But do you think someone can use solitary confinement to their advantage? No, like I wouldn't necessarily say raise the level of their consciousness, but kind of not really become enlightened. But I think prison is a representation of your mind. Physically, you're behind four walls, but where you actually are, it's your head. And a lot of times, when we're outside the prison in normal life, you actually spend a lot of time just going away from your mind. You don't want to see what's in there. So you're occupying yourselves with shows and other forms of entertainment, but in prison, it's all taken away. And that's the first time that a lot of people see what is in their heads actually, right? So prison, in a physical sense, is a place behind four doors. In an actual sense, is a place in people's minds, right? So it really plays out. So can you use that boredom to your advantage because you have a lot of time on your hands?
No, impossible. Empirically proven to be impossible. And it's because the premise is wrong. It's not an environment. Your body does not permit you to be in peace in that environment. You can't fool yourself into believing that this is a Buddhist retreat. You recognize your body picks up the smells and the sounds and the feelings of confinement, and it wants to reject it. And it's so overwhelming. It's animalistic. It's like an animal caught in a trap. You have to provide an environment. You talked about that peaceful thought, meditative things. There are a number of studies all over the world, from India to China to Canada, where prisoners do use meditation very effectively to quiet all those disquieting thoughts. We were encouraged to do it in the programs that I engaged in. You can't do it in segregation. It's physically impossible to do it because your body won't let you do it. It's dumping noradrenaline and all kinds of chemicals in through your endocrine system that cause you to have flight or fight responses, and you can't gather your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that, I'm really skeptical about ex-inmates who come out and they say they became enlightened in a prison. Like, I understand you can see it in two lights, right? So one is hell, the other one is a challenging environment with a lot of people who need help. And you can find your purpose in prison. But I think that just this notion of being enlightened by the prison, when you just think it's a little bit for show. Anyway.
Yeah, you have a lot of time on your hands. You have to still make a very conscious effort to do it, because prison is a place where prison is only about two things: power and control. That's the end all and be all of incarceration. And nobody runs a prison. I will live and die by those words, because there's kind of three factors or communities that intersect in prison. One is the prisoners, of course. The other one is the frontline correctional staff, often unionized, often with an agenda. And then there are the managers, kind of the ivory tower guys and those with professional educations who try and keep the guards and the inmates from killing each other, right? Nobody runs prison. It's a cooperative, and there's a balance. And when it gets out of balance, one of the segments has much more control than the other one. If in a riot, the inmates are in charge. Then the army comes and the army's in charge. Then we get back to the balance and the managers are in charge, right? So we have to keep it balanced all the time. One of the things that prison administrators do, and it works very effectively for guards too, because it leads to them having less physical work to do, is they try and keep the inmates as productive as possible. Not productive, that's the wrong word. As occupied as possible. Yeah. So the primary thing that they give people to be occupied that's cheap is cable television. 96 channels of tripe, right? And then they also give them these old video games, and they play these video games. And so they give them stuff to stay occupied. So you could literally, and then of course there's the things that you can do to be occupied that are not legal and much less helpful to getting out of prison. Drugs, gang stuff, making weapons, all that kind of stuff. You have to make a very conscious effort to take ownership of your own life in order to say, you know what? I'm not going to go play poker today. I'm going to go meditate. I'm going to go exercise, or I'm going to go write some poetry or something. That's a very conscious, and you have to drive yourself to do it, because the ennui of prison can really flatten you out, and you don't have a lot of energy left to do those things sometimes.
Well, there's also something to be said about correctional officers, because those are people who they experience high stress levels on a daily. Every time an alarm pops, one of these people are running towards something that they should probably want to run from. And if you experience 5 alarms per day, that's your cortisol levels jumping through the roof 5 times a day, right? I mean, we send soldiers to war, even if it's only a year, they may come back with like a PTSD, totally traumatized. And here it's just unlimited, or decades of doing your work, right? So, I mean, I'm not comparing working in prison to going to a war every day, but many of these people are just as traumatized as the prisoners. Like statistics show that as an average person who's never been to jail, you have less than 5 very, very traumatic incidents in your life, right? Where your cortisol goes through the roof, adrenaline goes through the roof. Now, for correctional officers, that's hundreds. And that space where they have in their pants for a pepper spray, like a Red Bull or a caffeine bottle, fits there exactly, right? So they're drinking Red Bull, they're experiencing high stress levels, maybe they work night shifts. I mean, these people are killing themselves in there. As a prisoner, like a new time prisoner, maybe you think, ooh, I need to look tough, are people going to respect me? But little do you know, your correctional officer is thinking the same thing. And it's a very similar it's a very similar dichotomy here, because also for correctional officers, there's a lot of peer pressure, just like for new prisoners. I mean, especially like first-time correctional officers. On YouTube, there's a whole playlist of training for first-time correctional officers, and a lot of it is actually how to avoid inmate manipulation, right? So these people who are in jail, in a prison, working there, these correctional officers are quite vulnerable to prison manipulation of the inmates, right? So like sexual favors, bringing in stuff, So these are people who are quite exposed.
I'm in full agreement, 100%. I think that the dichotomy that is presented in the prison regime of us versus them is a completely unhelpful dichotomy for either party. And some of these folks that come in to work in corrections, let's be magnanimous and say many of these folks who come to work in corrections are there for sincere reasons. They believe in change, they want to help people, and they see some very, very traumatic events for sure. Then they experience the internal political pressures within their own faction. And guards are a faction. They have a faction just like inmates have a faction. There's peer pressure, there's peer support, there's stress for guards for sure. I think the model is broken. The prison system that we inherited from the Quakers in New York and Pennsylvania, and some of it that sort of trickled over from the British Empire, is no longer useful for 21st century informed criminal justice decisions. Full stop. I was with a man who was suspected of murder of a prison guard in 1966, and he spent 3.5 years in solitary confinement in the Kingston Penitentiary from 66 till 69. His movement out of that unit was national news for Canada. So, when I met this guy, he was 79 years old and still incarcerated. And I don't play the banjo and I'm not good at carving. So I like to go and see what's up with people. I'm like you. I like to talk to people and find out what's up. I went and I asked him questions, what was it like? And what did you learn? And what sort of little mantras do you have to get a person through this? And one of the things he talked about was you have to learn how to shut your brain off. Because in that room, that he was in for 3.5 years, nothing was happening. There was no external input. The guard would come by and throw a sandwich on his floor 3 times a day, and sometimes it was urinated on because they thought he had killed another correctional officer. But other than that, there was nothing happening in that room. It all happened in his head. All the fights, all the arguments, all the anger, all the depression was all... That's prison. Just spread that out over a number of people, because prison is nothing. It's just a room. It's just a place that's segregated from society. It's what happens in people's heads inside that room that determines the entire outcome of the experience. And so in Canada, we spend a lot of money. You read my report. We spend almost $3 billion to incarcerate only 14,000 people. I once only half joked with a prison administrator, I can't afford to get out of here.
And well, there's also something that I don't think it's really talked about enough about coming out of prison. It's called sensory overload, right? So sensory overload is where your 5 senses, so light, sound, taste, touch, and smell, take in more information that your brain can actually process, right? So then, overwhelmed by all the input, the brain of an ex-prisoner responds as it would to like a life-threatening situation, right? So it enters fight or flight mode. So decision fatigue is real, and people don't really realize that that's what's waiting out there for you if you've been in prison for a very long time. Because people who've been outside of the jail, like in population, right, who'd never been in jail, we make 15,000 to 35,000 decisions per day. Now, most of them are unconscious, but a fraction of those are conscious. So on average, 1,500. Your average inmate in a medium to maximum security prison makes 100. I listened to an interview with an ex-inmate. He came out of a long prison sentence, and he was talking about how he went to Subway and he couldn't order a sandwich. He couldn't order a sandwich. Their halfway house, they give them 4 hours to leave for shopping because they knew about the sensory overload, and they knew that this is actually how long it takes for them to do the shopping. Because in prison, if you have a luxury of choosing, you can choose between two toothpastes. So you have either one or the other. In a grocery store, you have like 20, and it goes the same for every product. I think that's a big part of being institutionalized, conditioned to follow orders and adhere to like a strict schedule that someone else designed for them. Right. So when you're doing that for a very long time, it really affects your ability to make independent decisions. To me, that really explains the trend of people joining Islam after long prison sentences, because all the decisions are just, you don't have to make that many decisions because a lot of things are already laid out there for you. So you know what you should do. And I think also converting to Islam, which seems to be a more authoritarian religion than Christianity, converting to Islam during a prison sentence, I see it as more of a coping mechanism than anything else that has to do with faith. But anyway, I don't want to open that Pandora box.
Somebody has to be the grown up. And in their relationship where people are very broken and very childish, and then they are put in prison and encouraged to be more childish because that supports the control regime, right? If you infantilize a man and turn him into a little kid who stands up and sits down whenever you tell him to, then that serves the control paradigm. Prisoner guards don't have to work as hard. Administrators don't have to answer as many questions about dead bodies and so forth because you've just infantilized the guy. But the problem with that is that you've got a bunch of broken people who are already acting selfish and childish, and then they get into prison and they're encouraged to be more childish. Somebody has to teach them how to grow up or even model for them what it is to be a grown-up, right? I don't know that that's always happening as effectively as it could for the amount of money that's spent on that.
Yeah, and another thing about these warehouses, when they find you a job, and you get there and they find you a job, these companies, this is big business. They take 25% of your paycheck. And that's before taxes, right? And they don't even put it in like a fund for you to have when you get out and you want to start something, want to start a business or something. No, no, no. It goes directly into their pockets. So it's legal pimping of ex-inmates. That's what it is.
This is all about Canada. Tell me about Slovenia's. I didn't even get to study Slovenia. Does Slovenia have a correctional model that's wonderful or what?
Well, in Slovenia, first of all, as a nation, throughout the history, we've always been very wishy-washy. If you look at our history, just throughout, if a strong country came and they wanted to attack us, we wouldn't fight. We would just say, okay, look, we'll assimilate, we will learn your language, just leave us alone, don't hurt us, please. So we are very weak in that way. And yeah, so here, like the maximum time in prison that you can get is 30 years. No matter what you do, you cannot get more than 30 years. You can kill a bunch of people. 30 years is the max. It's really hard to get to prison, actually. You have to do some serious stuff. And when you're in the prison, it's more kind of like a hotel experience. You have your TV, you get good food, you don't really have to do anything. You have some activities, some schedule. And yeah, so now during the winter, there's a lot of homeless people trying to commit a crime that's serious enough, for obvious reasons. So
Why? Why? You guys are part of the EU. So you're part of all of the kind of regulatory organs that govern the EU. why Slovenia doesn't have that burn in hell sentence, because Slovenia is its history is all Catholic. It's a very Catholic country. That part of the world is, you're right next to Italy and the whole Roman Church thing. So that burn in hell mentality, which is what I think brought all of these crazy sentences to the United States and even Canada, but it doesn't exist in Slovenia. Why is that?
Well, we just talked about it's the mindset. You cannot tell me a prison system is not a representation of the country's mindset. I mean, you can tell a lot about a nation by how they treat their elderly and their prisoners. So it really goes to show, and also in the United States, people like violence, they like true crime, and it shows in prison. It definitely shows in the prison system. So it's a very good representation, a lot better than we think actually. So Canada has one super max security prison, the SHU, Special Handling Unit. So this one is for prisoners who are too dangerous to even be in maximum security prison. Do you have any insight into what's the difference between max and super max? Because I couldn't really find it online.
Yeah, just levels of control. That's what it is. It's so there's more doors. You have to go through more doors to get from your cell to the shower, and the necessities of life, right? Shower, food, exercise. There's more physical barriers to go through, and less opportunities for you to be violent with a staff member or a fellow inmate.
And of course, less services, right? Because why not? I think this is something that prison just does the opposite of what it should do. So people in like higher security prisons, they're obviously more mentally challenged, more they have more mental issues, obviously, right? Obviously, than people in like medium and low security prisons. These people who have more mental issues, they should be receiving more social services. But the prison does the reverse. So the higher your security level, the less social services you get. So they want to, they want to traumatize these individuals even more. No vitamin D, no social services. Fuck you. What was it like coming out of a prison after a long prison sentence? How did you feel?
I just continued in that sense of responsibility. And I have to be quite honest about the Canadian correctional system. They actually supported me in that process, because rather than just sending me directly home, they sent me to a halfway house. And the halfway house that they sent me to gave me a gradual process of release. The first, I think, month that I was there, I was not permitted to come home to my family home for the weekends. The second month, I was allowed to come home 2 days. And it wasn't a case of jumping through hoops and earning things like a dog bone. It was the case of a very measured and gradual release that was monitored. And then they gave me staff people, psychologist and a programs coordinator to work with, that I could feel free to talk about my feelings and my experiences, which was really helpful, super helpful. Then I'm also married to a woman who is like a psychologist. And so every Monday night we have date night with roasted garlic and cheese, and we sit on the couch and we talk about how's it going? How are you feeling? What's happening for you? So I advise folks in my circumstance to do that same thing, to provide themselves with as much support network as they can. And then the other thing is just, you got to have a sense of humor, okay? I mean, my God, I lived in my bathroom for 30 years, all right? So if you can't laugh at yourself, I mean, to visit my children on Wednesday night would require me bending over and spreading my ass cheeks open to two grown men afterwards, okay? If you don't have a sense of humor after that, I don't know what you do have. But so I came out and I had no problem laughing at myself. And then because I'm married to someone who laughs at me all the time, I was helped with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of all the people who have no family and have $2 in their pockets. Imagine that, and you don't even know how to turn on a computer, and you have nobody.
Amen. Amen to that, sister. Holy smokes.
I mean, it's an issue of being community-less, because forget homelessness, a lot of people are actually homeless without even realizing. And without us realizing, and them, because they live in motels or maybe in their cars, or they live with a friend, but it's not such a big problem. I think community less is what hits people. there is an approach of trying to offer like an artificial family structure to prisoners, to ex-prisoners, by having families invite them in to live with them for a little while. I can totally see how this is maybe a little bit too outside of the box for a lot of people, especially if they have kids, because you cannot really get past your judgmental way of thinking. I know these people went through their rehabilitation, if the prison functions correctly, which it doesn't, but let's say, but okay, you invite someone in who murdered someone. They were in an institution for 20 years and you're just inviting them home. I don't really see, I mean, it would be a genius move. I think it would really decrease the level of reincarceration, but just getting people to do that, I think it's gonna be quite a challenge.
Here's an anecdote. Oh, it gets worse than that. Here's an anecdotal story. Guy comes out of prison, and because he's in prison for some sort of a sexual component that I don't want to know, right? Comes out, nice guy though, really nice guy, cordial, friendly, kind of guy that you like talking to. And so I pick up quickly that he has some sort of a restriction based on internet and cell phone capacity because of his offense. Whatever, not my problem. But I am talking to him regularly. I'm asking, how's it going for you? And he says, well, I'm going through psychological services. I'm trying to find a job. I can't find a job. So the first thing I ask him is, are you Googleable? And so we Google him and he doesn't come up anywhere. I say, okay, good. You're ahead of the game. Just apply for jobs everywhere. Problem, he comes out the week after he comes out, the city that we live in of 175,000 people, the bus goes on strike for 5 months. It's the middle of the winter. His family is not here. He's a social pariah in his own community. He can't return there. He can't use the internet. He has no cell phone capacity. So I thought, I'd like to do something to help that. So I work for an organization called the John Howard Society of Canada. I have employment with them. And I thought I would like to develop an app that folks in this guy's circumstance can use that can help him to get around and that can have, the capacity of a VPN so that people can monitor what he's using so that everybody can feel good and hang on to the rope together. And so that's what I'm working on right now. That's my new strategy, is helping guys. I've been using my own experience from going to prison. I'm the test pilot, and then the experiences of guys around me and what they need, right? And again, I'm not patting myself on the back. This is all paying me. I get to give back. And so I get to turn some of that negative energy, hopefully, in a positive direction, right?
And I don't think people really realize how much family structure is actually important. Um, and I've said that before on my podcast. It gives you identity, right? So, for example, in Canada, in United States, and also here in Europe, we have very low reproduction rate. Like India, for example, or Niger, they have a very high reproduction rate. Because like here in my city, when I walk around, there's not a lot of people. It's like a fucking zombie town. I was in India like a month ago. There's a lot of people there, man. So, I mean, naturally, they're going to start immigrating. So you have no identity because there's no family. I mean, there's no community. So people are crossing the border, coming to you, and you're losing your community, right? I'm not saying people don't mix with other races. You can do whatever the fuck you want, but it is the case. And I talked that before on my podcast. This is something that United States is really missing. They're going to kill themselves from within if they don't change that. The structure is just lost. The idea of Americans is lost. They're telling their kids to be ashamed to be American. They're telling them not to procreate. That it's not a great strategy. I watched a documentary on Canadian prison system because I actually wanted to learn something, but it was impossible because I think also what Canada does is they place a lot of emphasis on marginalized groups, which I understand, I mean, some people are discriminated against, but why? I mean, it was all about systemic racism, you know? I'm not saying there isn't racism, but I'm always skeptical about the reasons behind these statistics. I think there's disparities in legal representation and access to resources, and that's definitely a huge part of the reason. But that's not discrimination, though. And I'm talking about indigenous people, because we know that indigenous people, they get incarcerated more. Because I think 5% of Canadian population is indigenous people, and 30% of the prison population is indigenous people. And they also did. They have this. Well, I don't know about Canada, but in the United States, they have a certain process for security classification, right? So before you're placed in a certain level of security, they have an algorithm that decides where you'll be placed based on the security category, right? So it's called a custody rating scale. It's an algorithm, okay? And now check this out. They did a report that showed custody rating scale algorithm is biased against Black people, right? Because it places them in the higher security levels more often. Now, mind you, race is not an input into this algorithm. You don't put race in there, right? So if anything, this is a proof that the algorithm is not biased. It's an algorithm, for fuck's sake, you know? Now, granted, correctional officers and staff are allowed to override it, so it would make sense to claim systemic racism if the algorithm sent these people to like minimum security prisons, and then the staff would override the algorithm more often than with whites. But that's not the case. So I don't know how the fuck they got to that conclusion, but anyway. But I I guess the real question is, what's the reason for Indigenous people in Canada committing more crime than other folks? I think that's the right question.
The Indigenous people in Canada have had a very bad experience. It's documented. It's horrific. It's been classified properly as genocide. It's a real political loaded word to say that what happened in Canada was genocide. But I grew up in a little city called Kamloops, British Columbia, which when you Google it, you will find that they found 200 plus bodies of young Indigenous people in an unmarked graveyard in a residential school that was run by the Catholic church and the government in my city. So I sort of almost feel like I'm kind of from Auschwitz and didn't know. And how dare I not know? So we're really going through an angst in Canada about how did we dare not know? And how much did we really, when we look in the mirror at the quiet night, how much did we really not know? And how racist really were we? So we struggle with that. Simultaneously, the Indigenous community at large, which it's even a misnomer to call them the Indigenous community because there's more than 600 nations that form what we call the Indigenous community in Canada. Each of them went through they're going through their own process, their own healing process, their own grieving process, their own dealing with trauma and so forth, intergenerational trauma. In the midst of all of that, we've got a correctional system where people go out and rape and rob taxis. What are you going to do? Let them run wild in the streets? It doesn't matter whether they're Black, Indigenous, or white. We have to have some sort of a collective response, regardless of your history. And then what sort of response do we have that deals with our own angst as a nation about what we did to our Indigenous people, but at the same time gives credence to the fact that we're a country that lives by the rule of law? And what you see, because we don't know what to do, is us doing nothing. And then the population of the Indigenous folks just goes up and up and up and up in prison. And the correctional investigator goes, do something. Except it's really hard to know what to do.
The problem is that it doesn't sound fancy. What sounds sexy and romantic is when you say, what do we want? Radical change. When do we want it? Now. Let's tear down the system. It doesn't sound that good when you say, what do we want? Gradual change. When do we want it? Well, in due time, in a few decades, if we really work on it gradually. It doesn't sound great.
Okay, here's a radical one, okay? We need to set up a Twitch channel, Twitch, the site, the platform, live streaming in Canadian prisons all day long. So people can actually go, that's what they do in there? And I'm not joking, because we have an innate need for revenge. We love it. It feels great. We need it as much as sex. And so that's why, I wrote about Tinburn in London and how on Saturdays everybody would get together and have a Frankfurter and watch Buddy get disemboweled or drowned or whatever to the, sense of burning hair. That was super popular. And even public hangings in Canada up until the 18 something, 60 something were really popular because we have this innate need to balance the scales, and revenge does that for us, right? But then we moved the whole party inside and built a wall around it, and nobody could see what was happening in there. And so people were left wanting. They're like, I need more, I need to at least believe that they're burning in hell and being sodomized in there. If you can let me believe that, I can sleep better at night.
All right. So, well, where can people find you?
You can find me at iridiangrenada.com. One word. And what am I doing now? I'm working in public education and public speaking, and there'll be a podcast coming soon.
Well, thank you so much for coming on this podcast, and happy holidays.